told me I was going to be following a magician, a clairvoyant. I did say I was happy to do this as long as I didn't have to put anything on my face. So, I want to start off with what is admittedly a counterfactual and hypothetical assertion, and that is, I believe without the publication of two crucial texts in the 19th century, Barack Obama would never have had the opportunity to have run and served as President of the United States. Now, there are, of course, many documents that fit this bill. We could easily say, for example, the Emancipation Proclamation or some of the constitutional amendments after the Civil War. We could even go farther back in time and discuss the promises inherent in the writing of the Declaration of Independence. But the two documents that I have in mind are actually literary works. And one of them was one that I'm assuming many of you are familiar with, Henry David Thoreau's Civil Disobedience. In that pithy, sharp, prickly essay, Thoreau says that because he is concerned about the government's, what he feels to be illegitimate war with Mexico, and the fact that that war is being waged, he believes, in order to spread slavery into the southern states, he refuses to pay his poll taxes and famously spends a night in the jail at Concord, Massachusetts. There's an apocryphal story that his friend and mentor, Ralph Waldo Emerson, knocks on the jail door and says to Henry, "Henry, what are you doing in jail?" And Thoreau is said to have replied, "Ralph, what are you doing out of jail?" And what he meant was that anybody with a conscience who was opposed to slavery, as both Emerson and Thoreau were, should feel a moral imperative to not pay their taxes if those taxes were going to go in support of a war that was waged to spread slavery farther south. The other text that I want to mention is even more famous, I think, and that's Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin. And there's another apocryphal story that is connected to Uncle Tom's Cabin, and that is sometime in the height of the Civil War, Harriet Beecher Stowe went to the White House for a function hosted by Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln leaned over Harriet Beecher Stowe, who was a quite petite woman, topping out at about 5 feet. And he said to her, "So you're the little lady who wrote the big book that started this big war." That's, as I said, apocryphal, but there is something, I think, true about Lincoln's statement, which is to say Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was the best-selling novel of the 19th century, sold more than any other work of fiction or nonfiction in America throughout the 19th century, in many ways was responsible for mobilizing opinion, for hardening attitudes, for getting people angry and anxious about the situation in the United States with regards to slavery. And people on both the North and the South side, editors, authors, people who wrote letters to one another, often attribute the increasing hostilities that led to the Civil War to the publication in 1852 of Harriet Beecher Stowe's landmark novel. Now, I bring that up, these two examples up, because I've been thinking a lot lately about whether literature still has the kind of power it once had to change the world and to change the way people look at the world and to change the way we interact with each other and we think about big topics. And part of this concern or questioning on my part probably comes from just the time that we live in and my interest in how various media, how social media, for example, how our smartphones, all of this wonderful stuff that keeps us going, may or may not be contributing to our ability to continue reading literature, In some ways, as much as I love my smartphone, which is tucked here like a security blanket in my pocket, it is a technology of distraction, and it is kind of a technology of fragmentation. As is Facebook. Facebook offers this great promise of community on the one hand, but it's a community of people sitting in isolation in front of their computer late at night, their face aglow in the blue of their computer screen. And I wonder whether or not in our present life, literature has that ability to change things. And I want to suggest, or I want to at least offer some hopeful ideas about its ability. It is impossible to say with any kind of certainty that literature, yes, literature can change the world. We have to be dealing in speculation and conjecture here. When Henry David Thoreau wrote Civil Disobedience, he had no idea that a man in India in the 1920s would read that work and would go on to use the tenets in civil disobedience to spark the resistance in India against colonial rule. That person obviously and famously was Gandhi. Nor did he know that Martin Luther King would eventually read the works of Gandhi and through Gandhi trace his ideas back to Thoreau's famous essay on civil disobedience. He didn't know that was going to happen. He was writing within his own immediate context, and he was hoping to change the opinion of the several thousand readers of his work, but he had no idea how extensive his essay would be. Nor did Harriet Beecher Stowe. She hoped that she would change people's minds. She hoped she would write a bestseller. She had no idea that she was going to do so. And that's the way art always is. It falls upon an audience, and sometimes it resonates with the audience, and sometimes it doesn't. But there are some qualities of literature that I think are worth looking at and reflecting on. And I wanted to call your attention to some of those today. One of them is literature works in a particularly interesting cognitive fashion, it seems to me. We are composed of words. Our inner life is full of language. Some theorists believe that language composes us, that we are made, we look at the world based upon the language that is coursing through us and that we read and exchange with others. I don't know about you, but I'm guessing it's true that something has happened to you that happens numerous times to me, which is I may be reading a novel by William Faulkner or Virginia Woolf or Toni Morrison, and I close the book, I get up from my desk, I then go outside and take a walk in the park or walk on the streets of the city, and I hear the voice of those writers in my head as I look at things. It's as if the consciousness of the author has in some ways inhabited me cognitively. I look at the world in a way that has been recontextualized. It doesn't always last that long. Sometimes I'm glad not to have Faulkner in my head for very long. But for a while at least, I see the world through the voice and the thinking of other people. Something that is only now being thought or discussed and researched in any detail is the emotional side of literature. If that's the cognitive side, if Thoreau makes us angry about slavery through the force of his arguments, something else happens emotionally to us. There's not as much technical language here to describe what that is. There are some neuroscientists who have looked at emotions and who say emotions aren't something that happen here or here, but they are bodily. There is a neural network that makes up who we are. And when we have an emotion, it is literally, there's an exchange or an interchange throughout that neural network. So that when we feel pity or fear or sadness or wonder or joy, we are literally feeling that in an embodied way, physically. An interesting aspect of this comes from evolutionary biologists who tell us that the way we feel emotionally is something that had developed through evolution but really hasn't changed a heck of a lot in 10,000, 15,000 years. It is largely stabilized in time. We obviously shift our attitudes as a culture, as a society, and as individuals in pretty short order. If it was okay in 1800, for example, to have slavery as a social practice in the United States, by 1852, just a half century later, when Harriet Beecher Stowe is writing, attitudes are beginning to change. But our emotions, and this is something I find really interesting and worth considering in greater depth about literature, emotions, it seems, and the way that we feel with our body has apparently not really changed all that much in the last 10, 20, or more thousand years. There's a great moment in Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn where Huckleberry Finn walks into a crowded tent circus and he sees a whole string of horses galloping in the ring as fast as they can, and suddenly these acrobats jump onto the horses and they stand on the saddles and they stand one-legged and they're able to do all of these wonderful acrobatic moves. And Huck, who speaks for all of us in a lot of ways, is wonderstruck and amazed by what he sees. But suddenly from the audience, he sees a drunk man stumble out of the seats. His clothes are all tattered. His hat's off to the side of his head. He hasn't shaved for 4 or 5 days. He's clearly inebriated. And he stumbles out of the audience and into this ring of fastly circling horses. And Huck says, everybody was laughing. Everybody thought it was so funny, but not I. I was terrified, and I was so scared, he says, that I started to tremble. He's feeling that emotion of fear for this drunk man who's weaving amongst the horses. He's feeling sympathy, right? He's feeling empathy that this guy may be hurt. And of course, Huck may be thinking in the back of his mind of his poor drunk pap, his father. The drunken man, wobbly, moving back and forth, somehow jumps upon a horse and starts riding around in the big ring, and he starts almost to fall off. One leg's dragging through the dirt. He looks as though at any moment he could lose control and fall to the ground and be trampled to death by the horses. And then he finally rights himself, and as he starts to ride around in the circle, he begins to take off his hat and then to take off his coat and his shirt. And what Huck finds is that underneath all of it was, of course, a circus performer the entire time. And even though there is a master of ceremonies over in the corner who has been shouting at this drunk man the entire time, saying, oh my gosh, get out of here, you'll be trampled to death, Huck now realizes it's all been an elaborate joke. And his body eases into an uproarious laugh. He says it felt so good to laugh with everybody else in the audience. And then he says something really interesting. He says, but I looked over at that master of ceremony, and I realized how he'd been duped the way I'd been duped. And I couldn't help but feel really bad for him. Now, Huck is this really naive character in this story, right? And I just want to think about something here. Huck was fooled by the drunk man, who was really a circus performer, but he feels a relief and a sense of joy when it turns out that the drunk guy's really an acrobat. By the way, you can't fake laughter. Actors will tell you this. As far as emotions go, you can cry, you can look as though you're full of grief, but you can't really fake laughter. Laughter is something that we share, that's in our body, that comes out emotionally when it is provoked. Huck says, I couldn't help but feel sorry for this guy over here. Now, when we were reading this story, we were actually laughing at Huck because Huck didn't know. And we took special pleasure in watching him figure out that the drunk man was an acrobat, just as he took special pleasure in learning that the drunk was an acrobat and that it took a while for the master of ceremony to discover this fact. Cognitively and emotionally, literature, I think, is a technology of connectiveness. It makes us feel the way others feel. It makes us think in new ways. It brings us to common places, to common experiences. It makes us reflect on those experiences and those emotions and those thoughts. And it is in that very dynamic intermixture of thinking and feeling what others are thinking and feeling that I think literature still holds a promise for changing the world. And so, as a concluding thought, I would just say, I hope all of us here will continue, if not writing literature, and I hope there are some of you there, reading literature, and I hope together we will change the world. Thank you.